Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the DGMT Perspective series joining us. This is the third series of digital and hybrid events that are organized by DGMT, where we convene different actors, including civil society, private sector, and government, and just bring them around the table to share their perspective on topical issues. The focus of today's conversation is the question, what are other countries doing to put their children first? This afternoon, we're joined by a wonderful panel who'll be shaping the conversation, but also for the audience who's joining us on LinkedIn, please add your questions to the chat as we will have an opportunity at the end to ask those questions to our panelists. But to start off the conversation for this afternoon, we really wanted to frame some context around why this question about what other countries are doing to put children first. And where we wanted to start this conversation is some of the evidence that backs up this argument. So the Nobel Prize winner for economic sciences, James Heckman, argued that early childhood development is one of the most powerful investments in human capital that a country can make. And this is primarily because investments in the early years provide this exponential benefit for the socioeconomic development of a country compared to other similar investments. But we know that doing this work isn't easy, and delivering these services that impact children requires coordination, requires synergy, especially in a context where poverty and inequality are relatively high. And that story is very familiar to us in the South African context. So when we talk about early childhood development, we know that a lot of those services are scattered across various government departments, various state entities, and also at different levels, right? So national, provincial, district, municipality, etc. And we know that currently one of the challenges that we face in South Africa is that we don't necessarily have a joint vision, plan, and a way to monitor the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve, and what that looks like when we're bringing together the different pieces of government, civil society, and business to achieve universal access to quality services for children. And we're not the first country to have this conversation and to face some of the challenges that we're facing. But the focus of today's conversation is really to chat to our panelists and to understand what are some of the key ingredients that we need to make this happen. What can we learn from other countries? And what does this mean for our work, for those of us who are in civil society or the private sector and in government as well? So I'm joined this afternoon by an esteemed panel. Our first guest is Senzo Hlope, who's the Director of Partnerships and Impact at Ilifa Labantwana. We're also joined by Yaneli Kotza, who's the Acting Director for Early Childhood Development at the Department of Basic Education. And then finally, we're also joined by Mastura Sedan, who's the Social Policy Analyst at the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. Welcome to our guests. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mastura. So maybe then to start framing this conversation, we know that it's widely acknowledged that investing in the early years is one of the most effective steps that a country can take to tackle the cycles of intergenerational poverty. We know that other middle income countries, similarly to South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, Chile, India, have also invested in early childhood development programs that are starting to reap some of the benefits of that when we look at maybe their employment rates, their literacy rates, etc. And we know that in the South African context, we are facing a couple of challenges if we're thinking about the levels of inequality, challenges around government spending, austerity measures, etc. We're caught in what we like to call at DGMT the low growth trap. So thinking about what are some of the things when we're caught in that low growth trap really hamper our ability to invest in human capital. So where I wanted to start the conversation today is looking at some of the aspects that these countries have invested in, whether that's healthcare, education, nutrition, literacy, etc. And Senzo, I wanted to maybe start the conversation with you because we often talk about the essential package of support that's required for early childhood development. Could you maybe first frame what that is and speak a little bit about some of the challenges that we've seen in the South African context of delivering these basic services to children?
Sure. Kenze, good evening to the viewers, and thanks for this opportunity. And to my co-panelists, whom I admire so much in the space. I think, Kenza, maybe to start is maybe it's just to simplify the language is when we talk about the essential package, essentially we're talking about the services that children, all children should have access to from conception all the way up to adulthood. So that's what we're talking about here. And we have simplified those by categorizing into 5 groups of services. The one is around maternal and child health. And I think as a country, we're doing well in that front. The other is social services. And I think that's the second one that we're doing relatively well in South Africa in relation to. The third one is nutritional support, and it's one of the services that we aren't doing really great as a country, and one probably of the most probably not even that difficult to achieve opportunity to have, considering the access to food and the value chains we have in the country. The third one is around early learning, which most people understand as crèches, kids being taken to crèches. And the last one is around caregiver support, supporting parents to become good parents and understand their roles and how well they can support their children and how also parents themselves can be supported. And it's one of those areas where as the country we're also not doing great in, along with early learning. And I think it's a useful start to understand those 5 services is, and I think the biggest driver, part of the reason why we're not doing well, is access to data that is useful to help all of us plan better. So it's difficult to know how bad or how good you're doing if you don't know what the goalpost is as a good start. So it's useful to have publicly available, easily understood data that can help all of us in civil society, in government, in business to know how to make decisions. So it's difficult to make a decision if you don't know how much money is needed, where are the services needed, and which service is specifically needed in which region of the country. So data becomes a useful tool for that. And I think South Africa is lagging significantly behind in terms of having this data available. And by data, I'm talking about simply administrative data that is already existing in some shape or form, whether it's manual in offices somewhere. And it's also talking about child outcomes data that will help us to know how well our children across those key developmental areas are doing or not doing well. We're also talking about data that also help us then to make those decisions. So that's the first main one. And I think if we can just solve that, the other things begin to fall into place, because the other key drivers of this is obviously, and then each of the types of the services that children should have to, they then have their own unique drivers as to why we are not doing well in some of them. The big one in early learning is that our regulatory environment is very top down in its approach and lacks the understanding of the on-the-ground experience of delivering early learning. For caregiver support, I think as a country, we haven't applied our mind well about what it means to support parents as parents in South Africa, in their households, in the context from which they exist. I think for nutritional support, it's purely just having a transformative agenda as a country that places food, children, and access to affordable food at the center of our agenda as the country. So again, if you look in each one of them, then but all of these, if we had useful data that can tell us where we're at, how well we're doing, and what decisions we need to make, it will be simple. So maybe the only point I'll make is let's start with data. The rest will follow.
Sure. Thanks, Enzo. And I'd like to bring in Mastura, just to bring you into the conversation here, because one of the things that we keep talking about is the importance of investing and the human capital story and narrative that we attach to early childhood development. And it's a term that we're also seeing being thrown around in a lot of research and in a lot of policy circles. But what does it mean? And why is early childhood development such a key determinant for human capital development?
Thanks, Kenzie, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this panel. So I think it's very important that when the words human capital development, I suppose another word that one can use is investment. Now, try not to use words that are related to war or to kind of, finance and economics, but in this instance, I'm going to use it. So the way the World Bank defines human capital development is, they say it refers to the process of enhancing and improving the skills, knowledge, abilities, and overall potential of individuals within a society, right? So essentially what they are saying is that we have to build society, you have to invest in people, and in this instance, you have to invest in children. And I think that's very important. The way society is structured is, and especially democratic societies, is that there's an inbuilt short-termism, right? Which, I mean, this year we're going to have elections, and then we're going to have a new government, and the new government will want to show within the next 5 years all the changes that they've made. Now, of course, new governments and this year things are a bit up in the air, which is okay, could present opportunities for us. Often want to do new things, and really for us and maybe I should correct and say I'm in the National Planning Commission in the DPME, and for us in the NPC, it's really about thinking long term, but what is happening in the short term, right? Because I mean, long term is meaningless if we don't make the investments in the short term. And I think again, the human capital development framework is useful because it also it outlines what it is that we should be doing, right? It's about developing an individual's potential. It's investing in the early years to help break the cycle of poverty. And I suppose here one should be talking about intergenerational poverty as well as intergenerational inequality. And I think, when we talk about investing in the early years, I know many people who know me to say, when we talk about ECD, well, what do we mean? Do we only mean a center-based ECD, or do we mean comprehensive ECD, which includes the first 1,000 days, the health component of the system? So I think that's very important. And we, of course, also know that adversity in early life has lifelong effects. And, in South Africa, we have a significant challenge with stunting. Now, again, to come back to the World Bank's definition, they also have a framework, which they call investing in the early years. And there they have 3 pillars. One, which is about children, that children should be healthy and well-nourished, that children need early stimulation and learning opportunities, and that children are nurtured and protected from poverty and stress. Now, just to come back to Senzo's points that he was making about the essential package, I think Senzo is spot on to say that, and I'm mindful that Janeli is on the panel, he's right that in health we have made significant progress. We are a bit concerned with the latest numbers on infant and under 5 mortality. It seems to be plateauing. But so there are components of the system that are in place that are working reasonably well. But even on the health side, we can improve, one, on quality, and then also in terms of, what gaps are there currently, in health service provision. But I think Senzo's point about parenting and caregivers, in my view, is fundamental. And I know that the DBE in their service delivery model has paid attention to this. And I think we should really, commend them for thinking about this. It's going to be challenging of implementation. We always know that is the case. But I also want to say that when we think about parenting and caregiver support, the value that underpins that, whatever form that support takes, right? Because it's a suite of interventions. Respect must be the basis of our engagement with parents. We shouldn't be blaming parents. We should be asking, how can we support parents? It's not helping parents, it's supporting. I think for me that is fundamental. And maybe later on I can talk about some of the examples, that I've seen in other countries where it's really been on the one hand insightful, and it also makes one understand, as I say to colleagues when we've gone on these study tours to Chile and to Peru, is I say to them, we can all read the documents. I want you to feel what's going on. I want you to see, what I want you to see is the art of the possible. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. I think there's something that you said there, the components of the system, that I think is quite important, because when we look at a child, we have to recognize how many departments, agencies, etc., need to be reaching that child. And I think that's part of the complexity of the conversation that we're having today. And what we know is that some of the countries that we've been mentioning have established autonomous agencies that are designed to manage all of these functions of early childhood development. And what it's done is almost integrate all of these services sometimes into a single government ministry or entity. So Senzo, if I can come back and bring you into the conversation about this piece around entities and different models, what are some of the pros and cons of these approaches? And what can you share with us that would be important for us in the South African context to reflect on?
Sure. I think is the biggest, one of the challenges we have in South Africa is part of the challenge with universal access to all services, I think, is children and household, they don't organize themselves by departments. And by that, households don't function in DBE style or in DOH style. I'm using that language literally on purpose to show you how disconnected, how we organize ourselves in relation to how we live our lives. I think what we all share in common is when we talk about children, we want our children to experience and show love and empathy. We want our children to be curious through stories, telling, reading, asking questions, laughing, crying, tasting. We want our children to show empathy for one another. Those are the things that each parent, if you were to ask today, they care more about. They don't care. That does not need an ID document to experience. That does not need a social worker to experience. It just needs a good, conducive environment. And that's why it's important to simplify these things. Then, if you're going to take those services and fragment them into specific departments and organizations to deliver disjointly, that's the first problem that you face, because then the question will be, and I'm saying this because I always empathize with Yanele, for example, because we talk about this all the time, is unless something is mandated, government can't fund it really. So the question of mandates becomes important. Then the question is, for services that aren't mandated, who is responsible for them? Then everyone is just eyeballing each other, not giving you a clear answer because it's not. So for example, for children, things like early language development, is it a Department of Arts and Culture? Is it a Department of Basic Education? No one knows. And if you're talking about early nutrition, is it a Department of Health issue or agriculture? No one knows. Disability, is it a Department of Health? Is it a Department of Social Development? No one knows. And what that means is children who need those services, then they don't have access to them. So, and I think as a country, we've gone through this. And I think then when we talk about mechanisms, institutional mechanisms or arrangements, it's really about creating a fit for purpose vehicle that will enable South Africa to have a common vision driven by common data and common planning and common execution jointly, to be able to drive specific outcomes that will deliver us the goods that we want, to have the children that experience the things I spoke about earlier on. So I think that's the main thing here. And whether that is an independent, legally registered entity or it's a subdivision of a department, it really doesn't matter. What really matters, it needs to be an autonomous entity that is able to make decisions, that is able to put forward useful data, that can convene various sectors of society to be able to get behind the common vision, be able to mobilize resources to implement the strategy. That's all we're looking for. If that's a government agency, that's another NGO to create, or a quasi version of the two, it really doesn't matter. And I think that's where we sometimes miss it by then working out on that level of technicality. And I think what South Africa has experienced in the past is during the RDP years, is when the RDP was the vision, when RDP was not just about RDP housing. It was about the entire development agenda for the country. We had an RDP office or a mechanism that had an RDP fund for resource mobilization. That was quite successful for a very limited period of time. During COVID, recently, we had Solidarity Fund as another whole of society response into dealing with an issue that we're all facing. We were able to deliver PPE, get private money, leverage public funding, use civil society to do last mile delivery of services. During HIV/AIDS endemic days, we had SANEC being able to do exactly that. So as a South Africa, we've done this before, and I think we can do it again for our children. And that's what matters more when it comes to the option we have around institutional mechanisms to deliver ECD.
Thanks, Enzo. I think this is what you're sharing with us is quite powerful as an idea and as a concept. But I want to bring Yaneli into the conversation now, because I think Yaneli, you're also well positioned from a real, departmental perspective to get a sense of, well, how does this land in the way that we do our work, specifically here with the Department of Education. But I want to maybe start the story by taking a step back, where we know that we had this function shift from DSD to DBE, specifically for early childhood development. What has this meant for the delivery of services to children in respect to early childhood development?
Yes, Kenzie, I'm so tempted to respond to Senzo first, but I'm trying to do emotional regulation as we learn in early childhood development. But no, I think the benefit of having shifted early childhood development to basic education is it's really, I think it's multiple. I think almost from a early learning perspective, it's really allowing us to have this continuum of saying we're getting children from birth up to school going age, and we're already taking them through the building blocks that's required so that when they get to grade R, we know that they're ready for school. So that's almost a learning argument behind it. But there's so many other arguments. I think the one is the fact that basic education, with all our failures, I'm not saying we're doing things perfectly, but we've been successful in delivering daily programs to over 12 million children for the last 50, 60, 70 years. In multiple, we know how to support institutions nationally. We know how to run institutions nationally. So there's a lot of systems that we've developed along the way. We know, for instance, the importance of data. As Senzo said, we've got a LURIT system and an EMIS system being run at. So there's a lot of institutional knowledge that we can transfer now. So yes, with all our failures, at least we've learned a lot of lessons in infrastructure. Like, how can we use some of the hard lessons we've learned and transfer that? And with many of the other things, I think there's so many lessons that we can transfer and say, because that's what we want, we don't want to schoolify ECD at all. That's definitely not what we want to do. But we do want to institutionalize it to a certain extent. We want all children to have access to an ECD program. And there's delivery mechanisms that's required to do that we've got experience in and we can learn from. And I think that is, so I'm going to slightly just comment on what Senzo said, because I think it's really important. Everyone's been bemoaning the fact that we struggle with integrated delivery. And I think we all agree that we don't know how to do it. And I think it's because of this realization we don't know how to do it. Everyone's trying to solve a problem. But what I've realized is no one's ever gone and done like a proper analysis of why are we failing in this? What's the root causes of this? And I find that we're trying to find solutions for a problem that we haven't properly defined. Like, we don't actually know where this problem is originating from. For instance, I think that the example that Senzo has mentioned on learners with disability is one that we've been grappling with lately. Because yes, I think Senzo is saying that no one knows what they're responsible for. I think everyone knows what they're responsible for. We just don't know how to do it well. And it has to be an integrated one. So the vision that we want to build is to say, as a child comes to an ECD program and have interaction with either an ECD program or a parent support program, at that point, can we start identifying, there's a developmental delay or there's potentially a special need? And then once that person, so firstly, are we equipping the persons that need to identify that to be able to identify? And then once I've identified it, are we equipping the people that can help? Like, do we have those referral systems in place? And does do we, like at the ground level, do we have those connections in place? And whether it's an agency or department or anything, we can set up the structures that we want to happen. At the ground, we need people to be able to make those connections. We need to define what it looks like. And I don't think we've ever gone and done that. Like, what do we want it to look like? Like, what's our vision? I think we've always defined our vision of we want with child outcomes, and we all agree on that. But we've never gone and say, what does it look like from a delivery perspective? And I think that Mastura's comments on like what she's seen and felt in Chile and what we're seeing and feeling there, I think that is getting us closer to let's go and define that, like step by step. What does this chain look like? And I think once we've done that and understand where the breakages are, then we can start thinking of how do we institutionally solve that. I hope that's helpful.
No, that definitely is, Yanli. And now you've got me thinking, I want to almost double tap on that point of, coming together and figuring out where those gaps are. If you had to sort of wave a magic wand, what's the first step that you think we should do? Because you're absolutely correct. When you ask most people who are probably, in the audience today, we're working in the sector, everybody's equally invested to achieving the we've set out. But you're right, we can't seem to quite get it right. So if sitting from a DB, one thing that we could start doing to be able to start identifying where those collaboration and implementation gaps are.
Well, this is perhaps not the ideal solution, but I know one solution we've been discussing in the National Interdepartmental Committee is instead of having our general way of reporting back on what we're doing, shouldn't we have problem-solving sessions rather, have a theme? For instance, I think one of the themes we've identified in the NIDC is, say, birth registration. It's a big issue. It's an issue for child support grants. So how do we actually have a whole session with Home Affairs, with SASA and everyone involved and say, okay, let's identify where are we breaking down on our service delivery? Okay, now that we've identified those problems, let's find solutions. And to almost have these themed sessions for each one and start highlighting where's it breaking down, who should be taking response. And I think it is going to be a multi-sector, like different people will have to take responsibilities for different things. And that's a good thing because different people come with different specializations. It's a whole concept of having cross-functional teams and bringing them together. But you need someone to just set up that meeting and start that conversation. And that's our responsibility as basic education now. So since I'm taking responsibility for that, I just need to do it.
Yanli, I really appreciate sort of that pragmatic way of thinking because Mastura, I want to bring you back into the conversation because I think from the National Planning Commission, you've almost had like a global perspective of the different government departments and how they operate together. And I guess what I'm interested, reflecting on what Yanli's just shared with us, what is it about how government is structured and operates that make it difficult to do some of these very things that Yanli is speaking to?
Yes, thanks, Kinsey. I think partly it's a mindset, which is, I saw a friend the other day and I said to him, I haven't worked in a line function department. And I actually think that's a limitation because it's an experience that I haven't had, right? Which is how to do things up the chain of command. I've generally worked in flat structures in government. I've had the privilege, I should say. So I think it's about, for me, it's about leadership. Right? It's about leader. And now when I say leadership, I don't mean the strong man or woman at the top only. Yes, it would be nice to have Michelle Bachelet, but we don't have her. So leadership at all levels of the system. And you will hear me talk. Oh, can I just apologize? Sometimes it goes a bit dark because it's my connection.
That's all right.
Leadership at all levels of the system. And I want us to think about ECD as a system. And when we think about the system, you were using the word complexity earlier. And I think on the one hand, it's complicated. If you think about 9 provincial departments, how many hundreds of municipalities, it really is complicated. And the complexity is partly, the policy environment, the institutional environment, and then the people environment. I mean, people are so important in the system. If you have, there are many good people in the system, but we don't have that vision, that singular objective that we are all working towards. I should tell you, I've got Mariana Mazzucato's book, Mission Driven Government, on my bedstand, but I haven't read it. But actually now that I've been reading again for this panel, I was like, okay, I have to read that book, right? Because Yaneli is right. She's talking a lot about, say, the operational aspect of delivery. But and here, Yaneli, you know, DBE, when I came to your Lekgotla in Daba, not last year, before last, and the Seychelles presented to us, you know, their system. Admittedly, they have very few children, so I'm mindful of that. But what I took away from that was how they had separated the strategy from the operations. And for me, that was a useful lesson, because I think what you are asking, why can't we do this? What's the problem? Is that sometimes we are asking too much of some people. We are expecting, you know, a small group of people to run this whole ECD system for the country. You know, and yes, I agree with Yaneli, the shift to DBE, in my view, is also a good one. You know, they understand data, they run these, you know, big infrastructure, you know, building schools, etc., etc. But ECD is the component for center-based ECD is a little different, right? Because it's these many centers all over the place. It's a subsidy system. It's not fully paid for. The model itself mitigates against very poor children getting access. So I think what needs to happen is we need to think about strategy, so vision, strategy, and then operations. Of course, it works in concert, right? But it's a lot to do everything in one go. And I also want to say that one of the lessons that I've learned from other countries is also that program design is fundamental. And I don't think we pay sufficient attention to program design. We leave a lot of things, well, you know, we do micronutrient fortification in flour or whatever else, but you know, does it really get to that child that needs it? And so for me, it's about that's an area where I think we should probably be getting some assistance support on, because even the programs that we have currently in place, how can we improve those programs? And then just to add, another point I want to make is about program fidelity. What and I'm going to refer to John Kruger here again, because John said we need what do you call it, these like Nando's and Kentucky a franchise. So what are the fundamental things that everybody has to do? And then if you do stuff on top of that, well, good. But I think that's particularly if one's thinking center-based, but also in health, what are the things that should be done? That not everyone should do. People can't just choose, well, today I don't feel like doing this, you know. So for me, those are, again, some of the lessons. But lastly, I just want to come back to Senzo and say, Senzo, the institution, what that institution look like, whether it's the lead department currently like we have DBE, or whether it is a completely autonomous or semi-autonomous agency, does matter. Because let me tell you, I work in the bureaucracy, and when people don't want to do something, there's a lot of resistance. So whatever we decide to do, we really have to build a consensus. I mean, we have already a situation where DBE is the lead department, so that's the de facto situation that we have. And, you know, there are some proposals about changing that. On the one hand, I want to say, oh, let's stop talking about these things and just do it, kind of, you know. On the other hand, I also caution, and let's also be a bit more careful. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. So many nuggets in there. And before I shift gears to delve a little bit more into the agents concept, I just want to nudge the audience. Please drop your questions in the chat box. We'll have an opportunity to have the panel respond to those. Mr. I want to continue this thread, but specifically speaking about public-private partnerships, because I think that's one of the elements that we've spoken about, whether it's what this agency can look like, whether it's semi-autonomous, etc. can you speak a little bit about what do we mean when we talk about public-private partnerships? And then what would it take for that to work in a South African context?
So thanks, Kenzie. So I think you're right that we should actually unpack what we mean by public-private partnerships, all right? Now, we know that we actually have legislation around some of these public-private partnerships, and so, which I know very little about, I must say. I think, you know, when, say, comparing South Africa to a country like Chile, which is now a highly developed country, right? Not a middle-income country any longer. Chile obviously has a lot more resources. One of the things I also learned there was the public health system was in a very good, relatively good state. So part of the reason why their program could be successful is what they were building on was a solid foundation, right? So in our case, I think whilst, you know, compared to other, say, middle income or low income countries, we do have lots of resources. You know, when people from UN agencies or so on, when you talk to them and you say, but we have a capacity problem, you know, they're too polite, but basically they're laughing at us just because they want, but you've got so many resources. You're just not using your resources optimally. But having said that, in our case, we do have quite a lot of different types of public-private partnerships in the ECD system, right? Across, if one thinks, for example, you know, the work that Elifa and others did with the Department of Health on the Road to Health booklet. I mean, the Road to Health booklet is impressive. I've always asked the question, okay, I know about the side-by-side campaign, but to what extent have we trained nurses and community health workers in using the community, the Road to Health booklet optimally? So for example, you know, around educating parents and caregivers. I mean, you know, sometimes I don't even understand graphs. How do we help mothers understand a graph, for example, in a way that doesn't make the mother or the caregiver feel stupid? I don't know what's going on. No, it's how do you, I suppose is that development word, empowerment in a way, right? Again, it's the respect and all of that. So I think that was a very successful partnership. I think that there's room for improvement. Then another partnership which I've known about but read about a bit more recently is the partnership of the Project Preparation Trust with eThekwini Municipality. And, you know, they've worked at local government, obviously at local government level and particularly in, now this is center-based work on building ECD centers in informal settlements. Now, we all know that is, I mean, that is like a big challenge, right? But they seem to have, you know, for the most part, cracked the nut on that one. And so I think I actually had told Mark Musselborn that, you know, well, I actually wondered if they had written it up as a case study. And I think it should be written up as a case study because we can all learn from what they've done. Now, I also have a bit of inside information because in my previous job, we actually, I was partly a grant maker. And so I know that the challenges they had with the politics and the politicians in local government. So again, I'm going to say it's not easy. It is really difficult, but you need I'm going to come back to the people. People matter and people make a difference. If you've got a combination of the right people with a mix of skills and political nous, because I think sometimes also people think, oh, these people, it's so simple. Why can't they just do it? And then I have just rolled my eyes because, you know, you don't know what we all have to contend with. So I think I'm losing my train of thought now. The partnerships. So I think in the current system, there's lots of different partnerships, many successful partnerships. But can I just say that unless there is a very clear vision, very clear objectives, and a strategy that we are all working towards, then when you aggregate up all the different partnerships, yes, it helps, but it's not moving us. The rate of movement is too slow, I think. Thanks.
Mr. I mean, there's so much as well that you're saying in there. And I think even this last piece about the rate of movement is also down to how those institutional arrangements and mechanisms are designed. And I think it might be useful to go down that rabbit hole a little bit. And Senzo, I'm going to bring you in here because Elif has done some work on this. Could you speak to what are some of the institutional mechanisms that are necessary to make these public-private partnerships work?
Sure. I mean, we are learning too, and I'll invite everyone to even share some ideas, even on the chat, on where some of the interesting case studies, even outside the social sector, that we can learn from. Because I think, I mean, to the point that Mastura was making, I also have a Marianne Mazzucato book that I got as a gift, and it's still also on my side. The one on the mission economy, at least I read the summaries component of it. And I think one of the interesting things about that book, even if I haven't read it, that just the summary that I read is exactly about these things of like, how do we work well together? Because the one thing we all share in common, even on this call and even as a country, is we want to get ourselves out of what you can say called the low growth trap. We want to get ourselves out of the situation where there is such a huge gap in access to ECD services. We want to get ourselves out of the gap in quality of the services that are currently being rendered. We want to get ourselves out of this gap of funding or resources required to close the other two gaps I spoke about. So that's one thing I think all of us can easily agree on. And I think is that a useful start, because I think one of the things, for example, and the reason I was making the earlier point is South Africa is not breaking new ground here, talking about public-private partnerships. It's an old concept, and we do it anyway on the daily basis, even more so in private sector. There are many types of public-private partnership. It just so happens in the social sector, the most prominent one is that of the state as the financier, financing civil society organization as last mile delivery of social services where the state can't reach. That's the most common one that is used in the social space, where services could be outsourced through civil society to deliver. The limited, that's a good thing to do. So that's one way of doing it. So for example, if the state can't get Stumkanduli to deliver medicine, then they can work with Senzo's Foundation who already operate in Mkanduli to do it, because it just makes sense. So that's a good way, but that's just one way of doing it. And I think what we've seen, even in countries like the ones that Mastura was speaking about in Chile, or largely in Latin America, even in the North America, like US's Head Start, for example, is there is something powerful about one, having a national branded identifiable program that all of us can recall. In South Africa, something of that similar magnitude I can remember is Love Life. Is in my teen years when I was in high school, being associated with a brand like Live Life as a young person, being called a groundbreaker, I think you will graduate to become a scamp or something. You had many brands, something of that effect, a household brand that each parent can understand. Under that brand, then you will have many disparate initiatives, one focusing on public-private partnerships for financing, public-private partnerships for program delivery, public-private partnership for vision, co-visioning, and all of that. So all of these are available. And I think that's what is missing in South Africa is right now, that's what we're missing. And I think, and I always say this when I speak to Yaneli outside calls, is I always empathize with DPE. Because I think when DBE got the function shift, they also, I think in a way, in that function shift, they got what I will call a Trojan horse. And I'll begin to hear Yaneli's response on this, because the Trojan horse in that is DBE has to play the role of being the prefect, the deputy parent of sister departments, in making sure they deliver in this mission. The NIECD, the National Integrated ECD Policy, places DBE with that responsibility, while DBE is also trying to create a vision, create a platform for delivery of early learning programs. So these are two very important things. And I think is when we're talking about institutional arrangement is there is a groundswell of knowledge that sits in the non-government environment. That could be leverage. That just requires like-minded people and unlike-minded people to be willing to take the step of engaging and exploring what that will look like. So for example, as my last point is, for example, in renewable energy, and I will make this as, because just to show we're not asking for something new, is in renewable energy, much of the models that get used there are what is called build, own, and transfer, or build, own, and operate. And what that means, that's a public-private partnership model. Private sector will build something, they will own something, and they will operate that asset for the benefits of the public. That's what renewable energy plants are about. Private sector, they invest money, they own the renewable energy, and they operate this renewable energy. They make money out of it, and that power goes back to a public stage like ESCO. We do something similar for toll roads in South Africa, where we use the build, own, transfer model, where you will build the road, the company or the concession will own the roads for a longer period of time up until they recoup their money and make the profits that was agreed on. They will transfer the road back to the states through toll gates and toll roads. So, and again, that's the level of thinking that I think we need to apply and challenge ourselves in civil society, in government, working for public good, to be at that level of sophistication in thinking about the appropriate mechanism we need to deliver books to each and every household that are of right language, are of right quality, are of right age for the children in those households. We need to think about how we will deliver a maternal and child health, in parent and caregiver interventions at that level, that's the level of technicality. We can't be speaking at the level of shallowness that is about the kumbaya effect of like, oh, we must do something. We must be willing to apply our mind. And I think that's why organizations like ILIFA and others who are working in the space are best positioned to do that thinking. And that's why I think all it needs is just the mindsets to be willing to cross that bridge.
Sure. Thanks, Enzo. Before opening up for questions from the audience, Yaneli, I wanted to maybe just speak a little bit to this and what Enzo was saying about challenging ourselves to be dynamic and to be thinking about these ideas, is that we know that DBE is already also thinking about public-private partnerships and what this and how this could work for some of the initiatives and programs that you're thinking about. When you hear what Mastura and Senzo are sharing, what are some of the things that sort of come to mind for you in a pragmatic way from, whether it's getting on the same page around having the same vision or resource mobilization? What does this mean for DBE pragmatically?
Yes, thank you. So we've come up with a new strategy, the 2030 strategy for ECD programs, as a way to almost start having that common vision. What's our common vision? But as always, I think the tension that we're struggling with is the dual role that Senzo has mentioned. There's one where, yes, we need to fulfill our mandate in terms of universal access to early learning programs. There's also the mandate of leading and coordinating the sector. For us, we see that as both equally important, but it's just staggering the implementation of that from just a capacity perspective. So our first focus is, let's just first get our strategy for early learning programs ready while we're starting to understand our role in leadership, and we'll need to come up with a separate strategy on that, building on the national integrated ECD policy, which we will be reviewing. So that we've started that process. I think everyone knows that we've done this implementation evaluation of that, and we'll start that process, and that will help us with that function. But on this function of early learning programs, we've developed this 2030 strategy for ECD programs. And in that, we've been very clear to articulate the only way in which we can deliver this is through a social compact, where we bring together the best efforts of the sector. And I think both Mastura and Senzo made this point that public-private partnerships, partnership has a very broad concept behind it. And I think we all come with our own connotations to it. But what we are saying in terms of our social compact is, let's recognize the need for all those different types of partnerships with the sector, partnerships with social partners, partnership with business and donors for funding it. And how do we bring everyone, the whole of society approach to the shared vision of we want universal access to early learning, to quality early learning programs. And we're hoping that strategy will be a roadmap for us. So, okay, we know the vision, we know the outcome we want to achieve. What are the activities? What are the steps that we need to do that? And we're hoping we've already started many conversations with different government departments, with the sector. Our minister is planning to have a business breakfast now, bringing on board business and donors. so that we all rally against this one goal that we want to achieve. So I think that is how we want to get everyone behind it, have very clear milestones to say together, this is what we want to achieve. This is each year we want to be able to achieve this and hold ourselves to account. But that is something I've been grappling with is one of the things that we're doing for government is to say, let's develop an outcomes-based monitoring and evaluation framework where for government departments, we know if we want to improve the child outcomes, Thrive by 5 outcomes, what does each department need to do? And let's start tracking our progress against it. So it's relatively easy to track government progress because we've got structures that's supposedly doing that, the medium-term strategic framework and all of that. But how do we hold the sector accountable and business and donors accountable in the social compact? And this is something we haven't solved yet, is how, if we all have our different roles, what do you need to, like, what's our monitoring framework for this compact? How do we get others on board and hold them accountable? Because it's difficult to ask for a business, oh, sorry, please can you give us money? But I can't hold you account if you don't give me money. And I think those are some of the things we need to figure out. Is how do we make that commitment to each other and hold ourselves, all of ourselves, accountable to the commitments we made and track our progress on those commitments. Can see you on mute.
Thank you. I'm just checking with our team that there aren't any questions. We haven't seen any questions come in through the chatbot. So maybe I'll give an opportunity to our panelists for just one closing reflection. One of the key pieces Mariana Mazzucato speaks about in her work is the shift in a mindset, being critical for doing this work. And I'm curious from our panelists today, in closing, if you could just think of just 1 or 2 sentences that you can share with the audience today around what are the key aspects that we need to change in our way of thinking to put us on a trajectory that we're talking about today. And I'll start with Mastura and then go to Senzo and Yanli.
I'm going to bang my old drum, which is when we talk about comprehensive ECD, we mean both the health parts of the health component of the system, as well as the early learning component. But I also think that there's a silence on the child protection component of the system. And given the high levels of violence in this country against children, against women, against men, I really think we need to pay a lot more attention to that. So for me, comprehensive means all the different components, and we have to build the ECD system. Thanks.
Cool. And I think my last offering is probably more on what South Africa already has. And I think there's a window of opportunity that is currently open to do something about ensuring that we achieve universal access to quality ECD services by 2030. And I think the opportunity couldn't be even more available now in the context of having upcoming elections, in which I think our children should be the front and center of the conversation. Things about affordable food should be the front and center of our conversation. Things about liberating women from the burden of unpaid care work should be the front and center of our conversation. Things about an enabling environment for early learning programs to thrive should be the front and center of all our conversation. The question is what role each one of us are going to play in that conversation. The role cannot just be, let's hold someone else accountable. It's holding oneself accountable and committing to what you will contribute in that Vision 2020 of universal access to quality ECD. That's the pledge we need to make. That's the conversations we need to have. And I think that's what should be happening in our dinner conversations, in our boardroom conversations, in parliament, in manifesto launches as political parties go to rally behind it. And I think that's my call. And I think that's the perspective I'm offering all of us to think about and reflect on from this conversation.
Yes, I think from my side, I think I've realized we can't do this on our own. Like, no government department can do it on our own. And I think the fact that we're here already as basic education and just reflecting on what's happened since that 5 years ago, the 2019 State of the Nation address announcing this function shift. And I look at the successes that we've achieved, it's all been due to partners. It's not been due to anything we've done internally. And I'm looking forward to the next 5 years. If we really want to get this very ambitious goal of universal access, that gives me pains in my stomach. Like we can only do that if everyone comes on board. So I think it's an invitation: is please hold our hands. Please, yes, as DB, we want to lead, but we need help. So come hold our hands, help us. As Senzo said, let's all take up our piece of the puzzle and do this together. Thank you.
Thanks so much to our esteemed panel. I've learned so much. It's been such an invigorating conversation. Thank you for joining us. And to our audience that's joining us on LinkedIn, thank you for spending the hour with us. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this, please do join us again on the 6th of March. We will be launching the Change Ideas Launch, which is a new initiative by DGMT to make public policies accessible to policymakers and the public. The event will be live streamed on YouTube, and we'll be having similar conversations to this, but with many others. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, bye. We're done.